today is the second Bois on Du Bois event. Yesterday was a public lecture to launch this series of 4 different seminar lectures. Today, we're calling it a seminar because it's going to be less formal. I don't know exactly what it's going to do. We'll experience that, but that's what we're trying to get people around the table. I see a number of people that are new today, so I'm just going to give a very brief introductions about Michael again. But I also want to then say, as well, is a big, huge thank you to the National Teacher Studies program in the International Relations Department that Fish runs, because that program has funded our event, as well as the co-hosting of sociology. So thank you to sociology as well. And so, like I said yesterday, we're extremely delighted to have Michael here. We consider this second home. Maybe you call it his third, because he has and South Africa. What you would say, South Africa?
It's the inspirational.
It's the inspirational home, and sometimes it's physical home too. So last night, for those of you who were here, Michael gave an incredible history of Du Bois' personal and intellectual itinerary through his historical journey of a particular period in human history, and he did it in 1 hour, which is quite amazing. That is, we all want to say, everybody I've spoken to was like, wow, you know, and it really was a tour de force. He was able to bring out Du Bois' brilliance, his reflexive method, his deeply humanist character, and his enormous contributions to the intellectual life of, you know, not just the US, but also the Pan-Africanism, to a huge range of but he placed it in history by highlighting the challenges, setbacks, racism, and resistance that marked Du Bois' life. So that was pretty impressive and pretty exciting for us last night. I also just, I'm not going to say anything about what he's doing today, because I don't know. But what I do want to say is just a bit about Michael Broadway, which I'll do an abbreviated version of what I said last night. Very good, she says, but I can tell no stories. He recently retired from nearly 5 decades of teaching sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and where he is supervising numerous nonprofits. He has been an ethnographer at workplaces in Zambia, the United States, Hungary, and Russia, and he's published path-breaking books. I'm not going to read them all. I'll read the first 3: Color of Class in Compromise, that was about Zambia, Manufacturing Consent. He wrote that before Chomsky. I just want that was his title before Chomsky, okay? The Politics of Production. And then there's a number of others, but for us sociologists in the room, the extended case method has also been a seminal book for us, a seminal work. Even if we don't always use it or we engage it, this is something that gives us something about it. And I also want to highlight that in his roles on the American Sociological Association, the President, and the International Sociological Association, he globalized sociology, but very, very decidedly and consciously opened up these institutions to scholars from the global south. So he really created the enormous amount of energy around scholars from the global south. In the ASA, he raised a tremendous amount of money. For the first time at the ASA conference, there was a huge presence of global south scholars who presented, and then the whole, it was amazing. So he's really done an incredible job trying to globalize and really focus on voices. And just to say, even most of you in this room, I recognize enough of you to know that he's been a frequent visitor in Future in South Africa, and I think he feels he's been inspired by what we do, but I think he's also been an incredible voice for us to engage. Carl will say to agree with, and also to learn from. So I think it's a wonderful relationship we've had with him over these last 3 decades. Okay, so it's really wonderful to welcome you back. Thank you, Michael. And I don't know, we have 2 hours. We're ending by 6, and I really strict on time, so people have to get out of here. 6 is not there to run over. But I'll let Michael manage until we can put them off.
I just thought that once I started walking, I was sitting down. Very difficult. I'll do my best. The idea is that this should be what was difficult about this debate for me was trying to talk about the Bois and the amazing scope of his interests and his abilities and his productivity. Amounts, I would say, 20 major books, and he's written countless, probably thousands of journalistic pieces, and of course, as I said, this an extraordinary activist, but perhaps not in the normal sense of the activist, but an activist in the sense that engaged and believing in the centrality and importance of the internet, and he was indeed an extraordinary. But the difficulty, the real difficulty, I was talking about the voice and learning, I talk about the voice in different countries, is the historical specificity of his work. But it is really rooted very much in, first and foremost, US history. And that is not necessarily familiar to, so it's still a crucial episode. I probably crucial episodes in history. It's one who wants to learn about the history of the United States. Really should go is actually one interesting episode. I still have a lot to learn. So, all right. So last time, that was yesterday, thank you. Very and to replace yours. So yesterday I talked about public sociology as a traveling concept, and the way I took it from South Africa, repackaged it in the United States, and then ended up sending it back to South Africa as well as other places. And while I thought that the way I packaged it was not really particular to the United States, but had a universal character, I was eventually, after about, I don't know how many years, probably 15 years, perhaps 20 years, no, between 15 and 20 years. Anyway, last year, I was forced by Carl and his associates to really begin to see that actually I thought about this and that the alternative concepts are SWOT, sociology, in South Africa, broadly, the concept that they have advanced in Senate public sociology is critical engagement. And so, yeah, so what's interesting is that my engagement with W.E.B. Du Bois, which began in a serious fashion about 7 years ago, has led me to recognize the significance of the distinctiveness of critical engagement. That Du Bois was not a public sociologist. He was not obsessed about it after his early years when he realized he could no longer be a participant in professional society and no longer wanted to be a participant in professional society. He became something different. He became somebody who was, I would now say, critically engaged, who was outside the academy. And he was developing his sociological ideas as part of his political practice. So I'm suggesting that actually Du Bois is the exception, as I said yesterday, the exception that proves the rule. That Du Bois was, in a sense, providing an alternative vision of engagement, alternative to the idea of public sociology, which was still rooted in the academy and in debates within the academy. Now today, and we can come back to these questions, but today I want to talk about another traveling concept, patient capitalism, which also came from South Africa, supposedly, and was then sort of popularized by Cedric Robinson in his book Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Language, which is where I'm training this story today. And he universalized, universalized the concept of racial capitalism and made it global. It made it sound as though capitalism everywhere was racial capitalism. Capitalism is racial capitalism. and then argue that capitalism did not create racism, but actually capitalism worked with pre-existing racism. But the Western civilization was systematically bound up, and always been bound up with racism. That is displayed. Yeah. And so the pre-existence of this racial capitalism, the pre-existence of the racial impetus behind feudalism, drove capitalism. Racism drove capitalism. That is the argument of Cedric Robinsondevelops. In contrast to the views of Marxists, most Marxists, who think of capitalism constituting racism, shaping racism, and being shaped by racism. Sure, the racism that we know today is a racism that is entangled with capitalism. So the debate is, does racism drive capitalism, or does capitalism drive racism? Put it very simple. So, I think that Robin Kelly actually, back to introduction to 2000 publication, that Marxism, says that Cedric Robinson, and he gives places also saying that he was inspired by the debates about race and capitalism under apartheid in the 90s. Robin Kelly actually thinks that it's 1976, the debates in that era were the ones that actually led Robinson to think about. Now, racial capitalism, I didn't even know this until this debate I told you, was actually a concept that was used in the debates about the very concept of racial capitalism. It was used quite a bit by Neville Alexander. And also by the Hampson, in quite famous piece that they wrote about foreign investment. But the actual, when it was relatively rare, actually, that the concept racial capitalism appeared in these debates and texts, whether it's the ANC, SACP, or academic scholars in Britain. Racial capitalism, in a sense, what people were talking about, but they didn't use that concept. Yeah. Well, it's interesting that if you were to read, may I ask a question? That's a question. Okay. So, has anybody tried to read? How many people have tried to Cedric Robinsondevelops? Well, we find one of these people there's not much reference to racial capitalism. And it's pretty simple, about 500 or 600 pages. Then he writes as well. It's already laughing. He writes in long, complicated sentences, and here's the trouble. I spent a summer reading them. I'm glad I did, because he had become a canonical text in the United States of America, and has made its way clearly to South Africa too. Yeah. But anyway, I was talking about the way that racial capitalism may have appeared in the 1960s. I'm not going to refer to racial capitalism. I'm going to refer to, because I don't want to be identified with Robinson. One way is to redefine racial capitalism, another is to use another term. I'm going to use the term racialized capitalism, which another use. And I think in those debates, if I may summarize, we will have lots of chance to contest what I have to say. The debates in the 1970s, I think that racialized capitalism in apartheid South Africa had two dimensions. What I call a class struggle dimension and an accumulation dimension. These were Marxist debates. And if I am going to refer to my two teachers, and they represent two branches. These two branches, two dimensions of racialized capitalism. My first teacher, Jack Simons, was extraordinary. Can I ask the more? Very good. You were in King's Happy's house. Happy house. Yeah, well, anyway, he was one of the great strugglers for the liberation side. And he, and it was amazing. Again, after 2 years, I get my voice slurring because anyway, after 2 years there, I asked him whether he could back me up to presentation. And he said to me, I thought, I can write a lecture recommendation, but it will be much very because that was my mind expressing the tears in the dynamic. Because he was a very powerful figure, very much an influential and in the essays he was with the troops talking about Marxism. Extraordinary. Anyway, the famous book that he wrote, which may not be so famous anymore, is called The Colour and Class in South Africa. And it is a history of the relationship between race and class in South Africa. And it is, in my view, and it's written, by the way, with wonderful race lands who were very active trade unions. And the argument, the book is written about under what possible conditions could there be interracial solidarity. That's the question. And why it continues to bring that. And it is a common perspective, Marxist perspective, to see actually race in the division within the working class. And as I will show today, that is also part of Du Bois's perspective on significance. My second teacher, who was more friendly towards me, but not in the beginning, but finally, was Harold Williams, one of the priests. Anyway, Harold Wilson, as many of you may know, wrote this extraordinary, I thought so, like an epistemological break, and with his article in 1970, arguing that the distinctiveness of South African capitalism lies in the way that the racial order is deployed to reproduce cheap labor, cheap African labor. The idea of migration. It is what I used to call the separation of maintenance and renewal. The renewal of the labor process takes place in the battle start and reserves, and the actual labor is in the towns of productivity in the march. And Harold argued that to reproduce this system of migrant labor in which the laborers continue to circulate from the mine, shall we say, manufacturing back into the rural areas, that system is reproduced by the states through the control of the movement of labor, through where they can actually live, through the Passport, through the Areas Act, and what is very important, perhaps we did not emphasize enough, and I know that Professor Webster would emphasize the importance of the colour bar within industry, that actually Africans were not allowed to rise to above a certain level within industry. There was a colour bar, you know, whites dominated blacks. No black did orders for whites. That colour bar was also part and parcel of the way in which the system amalgamated. That was a story of accumulation. How does South African capitalism accumulate through the deployment of cheap labour? It has consequences for blacks. So the project was to talk about accumulation and the way the state organizes the migrant labour system through the construction of the apartheid world. Now I'm going to simplify a bit because we say that the system really only works under a period of segregation. And apartheid was actually reflected the breakdown of the subsistence agriculture that supported cheap labour, and apartheid now introduced a new mechanism of cheap labour, that is repression. But anyway, what I want to emphasize here is that how W.E.B was focused on an accumulation project, and that was very much at odds with the perspective, not at odds, but very different from the perspective of Jack Simon's, which was to do with the character of each row. And of course, Howard was criticized for not paying sufficient attention to it. Well, this is about Du Bois, right? Well, what I want to do is, let me say a little bit now about how Cedric Robinson appropriates W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Marxism. You get pretty bored, I suspect, with the first opening chapters of Black Marxism. One of the interesting chapters is on the Irish question. So one of the ambiguities in that whole point is the Irish are a race in England. But the last parts of the book are to reinterpret three Black Marxists. Mostly are James and Richard Rouse. And what he tries to show is that they each give up Marxism for the Black radical tradition. Now, the Black radical tradition is the long development of an alternative, autonomous, radical tradition in opposition to Western civilization generally and capitalism. And this Black radical tradition is based on what I believe and others believe to sort of mythological view of Africanity that comes with the enslaved population. Yeah. And what Robinson argues is that, in the case of Du Bois, that his Marxism that he recognized in, and he's referring to Black Reconstruction, that one very famous thick book of Du Bois, the least accessible of its usually very accessible writings. In that book, Robinson claims that Du Bois shifts from Marxism to the Black radical tradition. That Black Marxism, Du Bois' Marxism, is a staging ground for the critique of Marxism and the movement of Black radical. So, and that Du Bois is a sort of a pioneer, one of the pioneers of this Black radical tradition, this autonomous Black radical tradition that is in opposition to capitalism. So, Robinson's critique of Marxism is a critique of Marxist-Leninism, very static view of Marxism. His critique of Marxism is a critique of the vanguard party, and the claim is in the Black Reconstruction that the revolt, the defection, as I talked about yesterday, the defection of the enslaved when the Northern armies were in the area, the defection during the Civil War, the defection of the slaves represented a sort of spontaneous, not only the spontaneous emergence, a volcanic eruption that sort of was infused with and carried by this black radical tradition. I don't think there's a lot of evidence in the Bois that there was a black radical tradition that infused struggles and the reflection process. In fact, the Bois writes in that chapter 5, the coming of the Lord. It is actually a sort of fusion of African religion and Christianity that actually becomes a sort of cement that actually forms a solidarity and gives the enslaver the confidence to actually defect. Yeah. So the critique of Marxism, basically Marxism thinks that the agents of change is the working class, and what Robinson argues, no, in this case, is the peasant. So he's refusing the Bois' account of the Civil War and Reconstruction as one made by a working class, first enslaved and then quote emancipated. He's refusing that, seeing that the origin is, he sees the enslaved as a peasant class. So that's the second critique of Marxism. Can't handle the idea of revolt by peasants. And insist on the vanguard party. And the third element that he puts it forward is the economism of Marxism. The revolution is the result of the contradiction between forces and relations to production. And of course, Bois does not put it quite so simply as that, but as I said yesterday, it is the dynamics of the slave mode of production that in fact does become for the Bois the generation of the Civil War. It is the expansion of slavery, the impetus for its happening. Yes, so that's what Robinson tries to show that through the Black Reconstruction book that Du Bois has actually is abandoning leaving Marxism. Well, on with that, that's basically the argument that I taught today, that the critique in a sense of Robinson, not the only one. He became he's like Trump actually. The more he criticizes, the more he gains support and yes, it's supporters. And the book has become iconic. It becomes the reference point for so many of the debates now. And as I said, so my critique of Robinson, he has a very narrow vision of Marxism. I have a much more expansive notion of Marxism, perhaps even democratic Marxism, expanded notion of tree of Marxism, and there's a plurality of Marxisms, and as I will talk about next week, one of these Marxisms is Black Marxism. So my critique of this is a very narrow setting of Marxism. And the second critique, he has a pretty problematic interpretation of books. And along with that, I think there are other places in the Bois that could have gone to get a more satisfactory discovery of traces of Du Bois's emphasis on emergence. There are other places where Du Bois talks about Africa. He writes 3 books on Africa. The Negro in 1915, the 1959, Black Then and Now, and in 1947, World of Africa. And those are the books that he does. that Robinson doesn't mention. Those are the books one will have to go to see whether Du Bois is trying to formulate something like a black radical tradition that is in sort of some sense autonomous from an ancestor to capitalism. All right, shoot. Wow, not long. Now, I think you can stop there, I suppose, but I have a PowerPoint. But what I really want to do, not what I really want to do, what I do want to do, is give you an account actually how Du Bois sees the relationship between race, class, and capital, how it changes over time. Now, when should I start? I should start fast, right? There's all people who. What did you say, sorry?
He said that in the comments.
You don't want to say that one. You don't. I'm talking. No, you're not joking. I'm dead serious. All right. I'll see if I can do it. I will. We got everything. I never go anywhere without. All right. Didn't I give you a department appointed once? I think I did. Nothing's before your time. Yeah. Can I borrow yours? All right, here we go. Here he is slouching. I don't know why I chose this picture. There are many pictures of Du Bois. Anyway, let's go. And that's what I've already done. So there we go. Philadelphia Negro. Race, yes. It's all about seventh ward in Philadelphia. And there is this chapter that is devoted to stratification. What is stratification? It is not what we around here probably would call class. It is status. It's a Weberian notion of status. I don't think he got it from Weber. It gives emphasis to education, income, and style of life. And it combines the two, he gets 4 strata. And the top strata is the elite to which he belongs. And it's called, he doesn't call it the talented 10th there, but he might as well have done. And then there are these, as I said, these 2 other strata, stable working class, unstable working class, and the submerged 10th. Submerged 10th, fascinatingly, are constituted as well pathological class, as sociology has done subsequently. So I call that SES, but then I think we study socioeconomic status anymore, reads about it, but nevertheless, that is really what he is talking about. It is not, in my view, class. So let's move on. As I said yesterday, Souls of Black Folk 1903, that is, I think, already becoming more critical. Within the Philadelphia Negro, he's trying to appeal to whites about the humanity of blacks by showing the ways in which blacks actually respond to the conditions of their existence like any other human beings would. And he tries to suggest that the elite, the talented 10th, are a worthy group with which one can actually build a true America, an interracial America. And he says, you whites should believe in the American ideology, and you should believe in the equality that is of opportunity that is embedded in it, just as he says to his fellow blacks, you better get your life in order. None of this drinking, you know. No, none of these drugs, none of this crime. You got to be following the work ethic. Du Bois comes from Western Massachusetts, brought up the Methodist, and his work life, his timetable is just extraordinary. And it's not surprising that he produces so many books. Well, it's the condition of producing so many books is his discipline. Anyway, the point I want to make here is that there was a political strategy, you might already say, behind his stratifying of the African-American population in the 7th Ward, and that was to make an appeal to whites on their own terms. Then we come to the Souls of Black Folk. Now he's more critical. Now he sees that so-called American ideology is a gaze, an oppressive gaze on the lives of African Americans. That's the double consciousness idea. And in that book, I love to talk about that book, but I'm not going to. Just one chapter. And it's a chapter where he talks about he talks about the organization of sharecropping in Georgia. And it's an excruciating chapter. It is, again, he's got 4 strata. But most of the African Americans who are in the sharecropping economy are in a debt economy. The units of exchange are bales of cotton, and they are continually in debt and never manage to escape it. There are a few people, elites, that do have their own land and are independent farmers. There are a few wage laborers, but for the most part, this is almost a new form of slavery. The crucial fact I want to underline here is now he's talking about this. He's talking about relations to the needs of the country. He's talking about relations to agricultural production. He is talking about, yes, race and class, but not what? Not capitalism. Not concept. Capitalism there as such. Okay, now we come to an epistemological break in the works of W.E.B. Bois, and this is my, as I said yesterday, my favorite book, Dark Water 1920. And now we have a racialized capitalism. There is a recognition, it's not a fully developed theory of capitalism. He hasn't read, as I said last time, his Marx or his Marxism, but it definitely, we have here a clear notion of capitalism, as I'll suggest in a minute. And this book has 2, in my view, my construction, has 2 major essays I talked to you about yesterday. One is The Souls of Black Folk. This is I said the book itself, for those who were not here yesterday, the book itself, Dark Water, is an autocritique, I would say, the souls of black folk. It's written in the same sort of idiom, same register, very literary. But whereas the souls of black folk was still an appeal to whites to treat African Americans as human beings, he's given up on that project. He's now talking to who? He's now talking to, as he becomes editor of the Crisis magazine and member of the NAACP, a founder member, he is now talking to African Americans, black folk, and saying to them that though whites are not regarding you as human, we must see that whites themselves are inhuman in the way that they treat blacks, but also in the way they treat one another. And here, as I said yesterday, is the instance of World War I, in which there is this brutal world war for the actually, Du Bois' view, the control of Africa. So that's, in The Souls of White Folk, is the story about white supremacy. It is the foundation text for whiteness studies in the United States, anyway. So it is an attempt to move away from the focus on blacks and to move towards a focus on the white dominant group and the imperialism that has governed the world. And there are 2 imperialisms. One that is based on the slave trade, and the second, when the slave trade ends, he sees a sort of what he calls a colonial imperialism, in which capital moves into rather than slaves moving into the U.S. South or in Cuba or in other places in Latin America. Now capital is moving into Africa, into other parts of the global South, and we have systems of forced labor. So that's one of the essays. And another way in which I could have constructed these talks, seminars, would be to actually just read Dark also. So I realize it's so moving, and that would probably be more effective if you don't listen to the single. But I'll just leave it to you to pick up this. You've stolen the air probably, but please go. Yeah. This is a thin book. Beautiful book. Anyway, doesn't matter. The second chapter, Work and Wealth, of Work and Wealth, it's called. And here it is, this is a study of the race riot of East St. Louis in 1917. And it is a story of a segregated labor market. In the north, in East St. Louis, where we have white capital. It's very clear this is now capitalism. White capital, there's white labor and there's black labor. It is more complicated than that, but let's leave it at that. And what happens during the war, there is an influx of a recruitment of cheap black labor from the south. And because the flow of white labor from Europe is stemmed, is cut off, and during the war, and so this generates ever greater tension between cheap black labor and the sort of aspirant white labor aristocracy. Yeah. And as I said yesterday, the book, the article is amazing because it ends up with a sort of imaginary socialism. It projects a future beyond capitalism, a future that, as I suggested, comes with phrases that Marx had actually produced that must have been in the air at the time in 1920. And the ideas of socialism are really fascinating in many of these chapters. So, for example, there is a chapter on industrial democracy. He says that we're going to have our socialism. This is another chapter in the book. We have our socialism. We've got to have public control of industry, and we've got to have worker control within industry. That is what democracy has to mean. Which is quite a shift from his view of democracy as associated with the voting mechanisms. Yeah. He has another chapter on service work. He always sees service work as menial. And he says, well, it's simple. In socialism, we just mechanize. So it's another quite Marxian idea. Imaginary in a sense, but interesting. Because he's seeing the mechanization that's going on in the auto industry, so we can do the same in service. There's another chapter called The Damnation of Women. It's a sort of intersectionist analysis of race, class, gender analysis. What is interesting about that chapter, well, there are many things interesting about that chapter, and it has been interrogated very fiercely by feminists. But one of the interesting things is he comes to the conclusion that you will only have some sort of emancipation for women, and that will be necessary for emancipation of men, if there are what? Wages for housework. Whoa! Can you believe it? 1920. Well, actually, I think it must have been I haven't explored this, it must have been also in the air at the time, because of course the feminist and suffragette movement was quite strong then. But anyway, he writes a few essays on gender and gender domination. And now all the feminists point out the difference between what he writes and what he does. But we'll leave that aside. But anyway, the point I want to make here is that he's elaborating visions of socialism in this book, which is completely at odds with what he'd been writing about before. Okie dokie, we're getting the, oops, 5 minutes. Okie dokie, let's see what happens next. Okay, so now we go to the famous magnum opus Black Reconstruction, about which I spoke yesterday. And I think that is an instant. I used to think that Black Reconstruction was the epistemological break, because it's Marxist. Right? So I said yesterday the reasons why he becomes Marxist in this period. But yeah, so I think that the ideas in Black Reconstruction, though are painted on a much broader canvas, can already be seen in Dark Water. So I'm not having an epistemological break here. But anyway, what he says, he divides the country into North and South. He's interested in the origins of the Civil War, and the origins of the Civil War are linked to the expansion of the Industrial Revolution in England, the demand for cotton that intensifies slavery in the South, and that in turn generates, on the part of the planters, a geographical expansion, which is resisted by the North, the industrial capitalists of the North. And this is for him, the sort of the genesis of the Civil War. So I think he's really still talking about, that's what I've just been talking about, the Industrial Revolution that leads to the expansion of slavery, which is the triangle. And you still have, of course, the separation of the slave system from the white working class and many of the white sharecroppers too, who are separated, have very little interaction with blacks, and many whites are actually in the business of controlling the labor on the plantations and beyond. Okay, and then there is in the north, there is the migration of white workers to the north, so from Europe, migration of European workers to the north, and we have a sort of segregated labor market there too, and I talked about that yesterday, and it is also, in a sense, an elaboration of many of the ideas that he already formulated in Darkwater. Yes. And then the Civil War erupts, and as I was telling you, what is very important about the book is the agency that Du Bois gives to the enslaved who defect from the plantations. And he calls that the general strike. There can be no doubt that he thinks of the enslaved as workers, not as peasants. But anyway, he thinks of them as workers. And then once the North wins the war, Reconstruction for 12 years proceeds. And it is, for Du Bois, a genuine progress towards an interracial democracy. Or as he calls it in places, abolition democracy. It is fraught because, of course, the white resistance. It is limited because there's not a redistribution of land, but nevertheless there is progress, whether it's in political rights, civil rights, whether it is in education, which is very important for him, and for welfare. All right, and so that's the account in black Reconstruction, and it's emphasizes too strongly is that Du Bois's account of this period of Reconstruction after the end of the Civil War is deliberately and dramatically opposed to the conventional views of Reconstruction in the United States, held by academics and non-academics. But Reconstruction was an unmitigated disaster. That's anyhow at all. It talks, and of course, the talk is of the corruption. Now, the corruption was the case, as we all know. Corruption has many sources. But anyway, Du Bois's point is this was a really progressive movement, and this contained what I call a sort of real utopia of an interracial democracy. And in places, in the chapter on South Carolina, the chapter on South Carolina, he wanted to call it the dictatorship of the proletariats, black proletariats. And but his friend says, no, you can't do that. Why not? Because this is not socialism. What do the enslaved want under the formerly enslaved want under Reconstruction? They want land. They want to be petty commodity producers. So yeah, that's not going to work. So he calls it the dictatorship of labor, or the rule of labor. That's all right. No, that's enough. This is black Reconstruction. Anyway, doesn't matter. But anyway, the point is he's trying to really conceptualize this interracial democracy in conjunction with a vision of socialism. All right, let's move on. Well, this is 1935. At this point, he has become ever more reconciled to the depth of racism. That it's not going to back away to suppression. expression. So we got it. He said, you always use these Gramscian words. He said, you can't use frontal assault against racism. It's got to be a, doesn't use this vocabulary, but it might have, it's got to be a sort of war of position. It's going to take a lot. Racism is deeply embedded psychically and socially. And so he shifts his position, gets into trouble with the NAACP because he starts talking about a new project of based on segregation. 1933, he writes the Negro Nation Within a Nation, and in this Dusk of Dawn, which is his third autobiography, sort of. It's a real autobiography. It's called the autobiography of a race concept. He tries his reformulation, re-understanding of the meaning of race through his life until this period. Anyway, he decides that the cooperative commonwealth is the way to go based on segregation. There should be a black, organized, collectively organized, planned cooperative commonwealth. Okay, and well, I think that must mean I've got to finish. Okay, where did I do wrong? Oh, there you go. Okay, all right, now, last. What I've been talking about is one arm of his development, of his ideas, the segregated labor market approach, the class struggle approach that he is taking in Black Reconstruction. Now I'm moving on to the second arm, the imperialism as a mode of accumulation, and his works on imperialism, the two stages of imperialism. And he writes these two books. World and Africa is largely about the first stage, and Colour and Democracy is about the second stage of imperialism. And the Colour and Democracy was written first, just after the war, when he was hoping that this would be an opportunity for democratization to spread through the colonized world. He was fighting through the UN for a movement of decolonization. All right. I mean, he goes on, of course, for another. He doesn't stop this guy. I mean, that's why when we get to my he does not stop. Changing the time in the past, and he in the 19, as I said, he was indicted for his participation in the peace movement. He was a leader, and he was acquitted, but he lost his passport, and he was joined in 1950, closer to members of the Communist Party, but still quite suspicious of the Communist Party for its participation. Today, in the later struggles, the Communist Party was the best party in a sense to be. It was the most advanced in terms of its interracial vision, but nonetheless, Du Bois was still suspicious of the communists because he believed that they were going to use Africa as shock troops for the so-called revolution. But anyway, in the 1950s, he becomes more and he becomes he can't leave the United States. His passport is appropriated, and so he's very distant from the really crucial times in Africa, the development of the independence movements. Even though he's been connected to these Pan-African congresses, nonetheless he only in 1958 does he and in 1958 travels to when his passport is given back to him to China and Soviet Union, becomes more involved in a supportive manner of independent struggles that are taking place. Yeah. So, all right, let me conclude. That's conclusion. I'm going over it. 5 minutes. Can I? Yeah. Thanks. All right. Development of ideas. This is my conclusion. Development of ideas as a product of, this is Du Bois, of his ideas and his political engagement, a product of his external engagement in a changing world, as well as his continual reflexivity about his previous positions. And so his theory of the world
continues to develop as a result of his engagement as well as his own sort of reflections on what he had claimed before. Second, that this is an analysis over time of race, class, and capitalism, but it changes over time. There's no one Du Bois, but I believe that it does move towards Marxism. It becomes Marxist. He thinks of it as Marxist. He writes two articles in 1933 that explicitly put Marxism on a pedestal, and particularly the writings of Marx himself. Though it's not clear, for example, that he read the early writings of Marx. It's not clear exactly what he read. It's not clear he read even the 18th Brumaire. How he wrote Black Reconstruction without reading the 18th Brumaire completely beats me. But he did. It was his imagination. Anyway, he self-consciously moves towards Marxism, and I believe never leaves Marxism. And it just seems transparent to me. Cedric Robinson doesn't really look at what happens actually to the writings of Du Bois after the writing of Black Reconstruction, and nor does he look, ironically, at the writings before, which perhaps would favor his claim. If anything, he moves from a Black radical tradition perspective to Marxism, rather than the other way around. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He works with two dimensions of racialized capitalism that we can find in the Marxist literature on apartheid South Africa. And Cedric Robinson undertakes a double distortion. The Marxist tradition is not static as he presents it, cannot be reduced to one wing of Marxism, and it's difficult to construct Du Bois' accounts throughout his life, in fact, as a participant in Black radical tradition. I mean, Du Bois never loses sight, never loses his commitment to Western civilization. In Darkwater, he's very clear about it. He says, yeah, Western civilization is superior. But why? Because it appropriated all the ideas from the rest of the world. That's imperialism. But he never sort of rejects the importance of the classics that he has taught in Fisk and that he teaches in Wilberforce. So yes, so the point is that Du Bois doesn't see a Black radical tradition as somehow autonomous. Any Black tradition as autonomous from the world around, including the world of capitalism, the world of Western civilization. All right, that was the fourth, and then the fifth point, and this is the last point. Therefore, what shall we do with Du Bois if actually he's not the sort of representative of Black radical tradition? Well, what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about next week Black Marxism, think of him as part of a group of Marxists, including Stuart Hall, including C.R. James, including Frantz Fanon, including Oliver Cox. Extraordinary number of them come from the Caribbean. It's very interesting. Anyway, so that's one of my seminars, and the second one is what's Du Bois going to do for sociology? What should we do with it in sociology? And I'm going to make the reconstruction of sociology. So you may find that pathetically false. And so that is where I'm in today. 10 minutes, please. Okay.
All right, comments, questions? Questions?
Thank you, Michael. I just wanted to go where you started. Had come to a seminar on Du Bois. But I mean, you have a criticism of Cedric Robinson, two levels. I just wanted to know what's your take on Cedric Robinson's history of racism, because the bulk of the book is about how racism predates sort of capitalism. It traces this way back, even from 40. I mean, how do you treat it's, that history? And whether in Bois, in this dealing with the relationship between race and class, is there a history of racism? Sorry, you said the question was. No, I wanted to know whether in Bois there is a history that may be different from that of Robinson apartheid, where racism.
Yes, good. Well, look, I mean, we can all read this book. I mean, my reading of it is, but it's very ambiguous what race means for Robinson. I mean, I mentioned the Irish. Are the Irish a race? Then he has, when he goes back before capitalism, we have linguistic groups, religious groups, ethnicity of some form or another. But he's fast and loose with what he means by race when he goes and in as much as there was race, it's difficult to imagine how it could be actually a separate tradition from the class structure of the time. That even in his own terms, that race is experienced as oppression, and oppression implies domination. And can one separate the dominant from the dominated? And so I'm not sure we can make the argument that there is, and indeed, even given his fast and looseness with the concept of race, whether you can see him as separating it from dominant ideas of the time. So yeah, see, well, it's a coincidence. So Bois distinguished between colour and race. He said, yeah, it was colour before, but not race. Race is a particular form of subjugation. Capitalist subjugation. And, that's what he's very clear about, even in Darkwater essay, which are briefly put there, but basically, he's saying that racism was constituted in that first phase of imperialism. So I think that it's when Du Bois talks about the history of Africa in his 3 books, I cannot see how, and the importance of the passage of not just the people but the culture. I don't see how he doesn't separate it from actually the forces of oppression. There is not a black radical tradition that is autonomous from domination, which is Robinson's point. That's my answer to that. We should have a seminar. Thank you.
Hang on.
Connected to thinking in a way, it relates to social activists. It's not a serious, serious chat. This debate, Woods has been involved with basic superstructure and comes back to the racism drive or drive person. You have very clear, particularly with the recently that has happened, very on how we organize, how we structuralize, how we see whereas I wondered in your mind, where is this Marxist motion essential to development of our understanding, and now we have a whole set of ideas of the post-condition where this is autonomous nature of race, gender, and it's actually very deeply with social condition. And still here, that's university in 2016 with a type of politics where a real separation similar thing saw in the States in the 60s, snake well, I think that I guess my understanding of where this has come from, reading about South Africa. I think the relations rather than capitalism are mutually considered. Capitalism has constituted race in different ways in different places. And if one takes a Marxist position, I think that looking at the two dimensions, on one hand, this is how I would think about it. It comes from what I learned about South Africa, the ways in which labor power is being reproduced on the one hand, and the way the production is being organized. So I follow sort of worldly tradition in terms of the first, and they follow the Western tradition in terms of the second, you know. And then one is to see how race is constituted in those two realms differently in different places. That has implications for the political realm. You can't reproduce labor power in the color bar without a superstructure that itself has its own dynamics and itself has reconstitutes the economy. So I've always argued that the economy there is a based in a superstructure in a sense that they are interactive and mutual. But I see them as mutually consistent under capitalism. You can't get privacy to profitability.
Not that.
No doubt.
The question is about privacy.
Yeah, well, no, I'm not. Yeah, it's a primacy of the economic. That's because I'm a Marxist. And that, of course, is the tension between the black radical tradition and those who follow Cedric Robinson, who want to give privacy to the rest. Racism. Both recognize both. And it is a political position, it's a theoretical position. And so, yeah, I'm still, a Marxist have to believe in some vision of socialism. So, yes. But I think I'm on the side of the Bois is on the side of me.
Just two issues,
Just two.
which I think are connected. So, Du Bois's analysis of racial capitalism provides us some powerful insights into the making of the United States and so on. What I'm interested in is how the contingencies and the dynamics of racial capitalism have also changed, and what is the value of this kind of analysis for contemporary United States of America? We've got Black Lives Matter, we've got violence, police violence, we've got incarceration of particularly black men, and so on and so on. So this race question is there, but how do you locate it in a framework of racialized capitalism? So that's the one thing. But the other thing is the anti-racism of Du Bois. And here I want you to kind of, because you get glimpses of, his socialism, so on and so on. I want you to think about help us think about how it challenges the Black radical tradition's conception of anti-racism. how much more radical is it vis-a-vis the black radical tradition? And what again does that mean in contemporary terms? Because I do think that versions of African nationalism, including in this country, have really been pretty degenerate. So I think we've got to really think about these issues very clearly. The stakes are high, because we are anti-racist.
We are tough. Okay. Yes, the race question is very racialized. I mean, the debate in the United States, you know, that there is a 1619 bracket, so 1619 or something. Not in 1776. And that has a sort of essentialist view. That we are living with the reproduction of a racial order that originated in 1619. It's almost in the DNA, as I think, DNA of the United States of America. That's moving towards a sort of African. The boys couldn't. It couldn't influence that. So the boys recognized, you know, the origins of the slave trade, but he is consistently reconstituting different orders of racism in capitalism. And so, yes, racism is in a sense continuous, but just because it's continuous, it doesn't mean it's the same. So, incarceration today is not the same as convict labor in the 18th, 19th century. And so, Du Bois has to, because of whether it's because he always has to imagine the possibility of alternatives. Despair there is. Every regime of racism ends disastrously, even if it has these moments of optimism, possibility. But his despair is always countered by the hope and the rethinking of what could be. And so he's very much opposed to a sort of essentialist idea of racism, which is what is in my view in Cedric Robinson, which is in the 1619 project. But which 1619 project is incredibly important in the United States. It forced people to think and understand and know something more about their history. Absolutely crucial. But you ask a political question. So what is the significance of it in terms of the way that we conceptualize an alternative? Well, I'm suggesting that Du Bois has always a way of living. History reconstructs itself. And we reconstruct ourselves. There's a sort of dynamism to his analysis, which I think we can learn from. This continual reflection on the world in which he has engaged and how he has engaged with that world and how his own ideas have developed almost relatively autonomously from his engagement. So it's a view of science that is shaped, or a view of scholarship, a view of history that is shaped by the confluence of an internal dynamic as well as an external set of external influences. And so, yeah, that's how I answer both questions.
Sorry, my question was a bit unfocused, but you started with the simplification of the Robinson debate, saying, you know, is capitalism driving racism or is driving capitalism? And maybe I wasn't being just I never understood exactly. You clearly said that your view Du Bois remains Marxist, but I don't see your interpretation of his intervention into that debate and the South African debate that you set up. Because I mean, I'm also thinking about the the South African tradition you were describing was also in a debate with the liberal radical debate about the utility of racism to capitalism. And a lot of the contribution about racialized capitalism in South Africa thinking is about the various ways in which race plays contributes to the utility of capitalist accumulation through justifying exploitation and expropriation of others. So I guess I understood your description of Du Bois as saying he moved closer to this kind of Marxist tradition, but I didn't see your explanation of his theory of racial capitalism and racialized capitalism. If you have it.
Well, what I'm suggesting is that's what I began with Simon and Simon on one hand and Walker on the other. Simon and Simon is basically the segregated labor law. And how there are moments in history of South Africa where perhaps white and black do form such solidarity, white and black. And so that's the sort of class struggle perspective on race and class. And then there's a walking one which is about accumulation. I see the same two things in the course. That's probably so many people in my head. But nevertheless, and that was my picture. I'm show you my picture again. All right. Oh, no. Well, it must be a very important conclusion. Doesn't matter.
Chair, can I have the chair for a follow-up question?
No.
No. An elaboration on this point exactly, because I don't know the science.
Yeah. All right. Just we can follow up in a second. Those are the two arms. Say there are the two arms of rope on the one side and some of the sands on the other. And if you the woke analysis doesn't really have an imperialist dimension, but it's concerned with accumulation. And the Gassic, of course, gives that global interpretation of the woke perspective. Right.
Well, I don't know the science, but there's this idea also in Marxist debate that Marxist interpretation suggests a kind of flattening of the world, and the persistence of race and racism is a kind of challenge to that. But one rejoinder to that is that from the perspective of capital, the world is flattened, but from the perspective of workers, race and all sorts of other things become tools that they can use to fight, right? And so in the South African tradition, we can think about possibilities for racial solidarity, but there was more history of racial antagonism in using race as a tool to struggle among the working class.
Absolutely.
So I don't know that.
Okay. That is well, everybody should be classic. Why is it classic? I thank you. I forced you to read it, right? No, I mean the grand revolt is that why would the world unite for communists?
Giving me something.
Yeah. All right. Good.
John, I was going to explore this question about relationship between the class and whether the voice focus on the accumulation part was the integration of forces of class and and for me, the importance of that is the socialism. When socialism was informed by that process of class agency, how that affects these items. Because mentioned at some point that sort of isolated struggle dynamics. So I just wanted to see whether these analysis of this in class is informed by innovation with heritage. Capital. Ties the two. Some point as a innovation. I just wanted to get the sense of the relation.
No, good. Absolutely, no, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm cheating a bit. I'm constructing Du Bois here in this picture, and it's my construct, my attempt. But the trouble with Du Bois is not theories. I mean, in the sense that he doesn't explicitly formulate theories. That's what's so great and challenging. That's why I made it in a little lad. I better introduce Du Bois into my undergraduate semester course, which is supposed to be, the great stuff. I tried to introduce sort of about you have to work with Du Bois. We've had a century to work with Mark and Durkheim. Now we need a century to work with Du Bois to really take his history and say that's what I'm doing. So all right, so let me answer your question. No, I don't think that he really brings these two perspectives together. So he writes these three books: the Negro, 1915, and then in 1939, Black Folk and the World in Africa. That's what I would call this the analysis of the history of imperialism, the two stages, the two phases of imperialism. And he's concerned there with the accumulation process, whether it's in the Industrial Revolution or afterwards, that is driving the slave trade and then colonization. And then he has the analysis of the United States itself as more about its segregated labor markets. Now he tries at points to say, yeah, they do sort of work together, of course they do, because what he is arguing, though it doesn't quite demonstrate it, what he's arguing is that the segregated labor market, with its, shall we put it simply, a white labor aristocracy, is dependent upon the accumulation process that comes through imperialism. An old Leninist argument, but Du Bois elaborates that in a more concrete, specific way. So I think there is a connection there between the two. But I think they're written in separate books. I mean, the interesting thing is to go back to Black Reconstruction and see to what way, because in the end of Black Reconstruction says this is the failure, the splendid failure of Reconstruction is a disaster for the whole world, because it then legitimated the imperialism that followed, the second phase. So slavery may have been abolished, but he's arguing that actually the failure of a interracial democracy in the United States made it possible for colonialism to happen. So the obvious connections. I'd like to answer your second question about socialism and capitalism. Because in Darkwater, it's almost as if he's saying that capitalism is more into socialism. That no talk of any revolution is happening. And you've got to imagine with socialism, but it's socialism, it's an evolution of socialism. Thinking your founders are, I think he begins to see how deeply intertwined capitalism is, that he really can't get rid of one without the other. And he becomes more focused on capitalism has to go if we're going to get beyond racism. And then he says, how are we going to do that? And ultimately, there are these throwaway lines in several books, sometimes paragraphs, where he talks about the unity of the dark races of the world. I didn't talk about it in another class yesterday, but Dark Princess, that's a weird novel. You might not like it, it's full of all sorts of stereotypes, gender stereotypes. But anyway, it's a story, it's a novel about world revolution organized by the dark races. And this, if there is not going to be no interracial class solidarity,
then the only hope is, this is like a threat to right, the only hope is a revolution of the darker races of the world. How's going to happen? Oh, that's what. But the point is that he moves from a position of a sort of evolutionary socialism to a very strong Marxist position that sort of monopoly capitalism states has been entrenched simultaneously with capitalism and racism. Sorry.
So I'm working on this.
I'm interested in this relationship between the working class and the peasantry. The difference from you point out that these are the challenges of the primary thing of the working class is kind of drive revolution that points to the important role of the peasantry, and that in fact in your construction of W.E.B, the enslaved were not peasants, they were the working class. And yet I find it interesting that the demands, as you point out in Black Reconstruction, were for land. And so then the question for me is, based on your reading of W.E.B, isn't it have a working class movement for the reconstruction of a peasantry, given the historic process of expropriation, exploitation, and so on? And what are the implications, I guess, of how to think about the relationship between the contemporary period, particularly the agrarian one?
You know, I think that, yeah, that Cedric Robinsondevelops really exists. He thinks that the reflection revolts the enslaved as peasants, as analogous to the Russian Revolution. Which is, no, he's writing in 1980, so yeah, this is the sort of becoming a sort of conventional wisdom. You know, I think that the Bois' account of the general strike, the reflection of slave. Yes, they are working on the hand, but he wants to constitute, clearly wants to constitute workers in a relationship of exploitation. The peasants don't necessarily have it the same way as workers. So it's slave owners as slave. I think of this general strike, its whole contents. I think of Black Reconstruction. What is Black Reconstruction? It's analogous to Trotsky's history. And of course, that is the sort of guiding force. And I think there are very close parallels here. Du Bois is seeing the enslaved as a sort of potential leading force for a revolution that actually begins to develop under Reconstruction and this integration of democracy. I think that's as much out of the but I think that's the more, that's, to me, so that's the real contrast. In my understanding, with Du Bois and Cedric Robinson's understanding, he wants to appropriate as a peasant revolution. And as a spontaneous peasant revolution. And the trouble with the Trotsky analogy is it's not really what the equivalent of the political parties, but, you know, Trotsky has a real understanding of revolt from below, as well as the importance of leadership. And the role, and what is interesting about that Reconstruction, and in the chapter of the coming of the Lord, you have a sense of the significance of religion as a cement of the revolt of the enslaved. By the way, it's not always, it's 500,000 hours before.
Michael, let me just quickly return to Ben and John talking about the necessary or contingent way race and class interrelate the 70s. No question, Islamism and anyone interested in the apartheid struggle, the class social struggle from 50 years ago, the early 90s. could make an argument. That's how apartheid. But if you take accumulation seriously, and I would, I'm not sure W.E.B did it thoroughly, and because his view of race and class, his view of race was Harold W.E didn't do gender. His wife did, Anne Marie. But in 1972, there's nothing about social reproduction. He didn't do depletion of nuts. Exactly. And that's a huge problem if you do the accumulation process and then you develop, which is free labor under patriarchal capitalism. And secondly, you're getting a free gift of nature, what we didn't reckon on. All the gold, half of the gold in the world at one point from here. Now we have gold. And so if you don't do nature within your accumulation process, you're missing. And then you don't do capitalist crisis. W.E.B didn't think that the articulation of its production would end. It was a very durable way. And in 1988, he wrote a book where he said, okay, I was wrong. It wasn't a necessary relationship. Capitalism didn't need racism. It was contingent, right? So you admit there, this version of accumulation dynamics was partial. Now, the question is, do the politics flow? And I don't know that Du Bois' reaction, but you say you have to get rid of capitalism to get rid of racism. This hall would have been full of good comrades saying we have to get rid of capitalism to get rid of apartheid. And the liberals would have said, no, the liberal capitalist meritocracy through its success will get rid of apartheid. And then they kind of celebrated, Dalapieces, that this is how you got rid of apartheid because, and then the radicals would say, no, it was a capitalist crisis that got the capitalists so desperate in 1985 that they went and started to make good things. So it's a very interesting set of debates that would lead us to question whether your view of race and class and conditions the way you see the revolution, whether apartheid or racism. Under these circumstances, it's contingent, not necessary. You have any view of that? And W.E.B's trajectory. Yeah. And for those with grayer hairs than me, from the 70s, 30s, there's
Yeah, no, there are just limitations of this. I mean, this 1972 paper was the beginning of a whole, what I would call a paradigm of understanding South African accumulation process. And it led in all sorts of interesting directions. First, it led, okay, there is a reproduction of the system of migrant labor. Well, the state's doing it. Well, how is it that the state does it? You have to study the state as he subsequently does. And then he becomes much more.
race, class, and purpose. Thank you very much. UNESCO.
Very good. Unimpressive. Yes. And so there's analysis of the dominant class, the analysis of the state, and then he begins to get understanding, has to understand the ways in which the state actually sort of demarcates races, classifies races, and how that will shape struggles. And he's also quite critical of I guess, the SACP's failure to recognize the development of class divisions within the African population. And others are doing that. Some of you are probably not well known yet. W.E.B does understand the dynamics of capitalism. And in the segregation period, the model of the cheap labor process. The cheap labor is works according to him, but then his reserves actually deteriorate, and so they no longer provide subsistence, and therefore capitalism enters a sort of crisis, and therefore you get a part of the struggle. But anyway, therefore. So yeah, and so the question is, how does one get cheap labor and apartheid? W.E.B says repression. Actually, Amy Mariotti, who does a dissertation yeah, well, she basically argues that in the apartheid period, what is the source of cheap labor is multiple earners of the family, that women enter the labor force. So that becomes a source, as Marx spoke about in the 19th century, that she started talking about the ways in which it's not single migrant men, but now we have multiple earners of the family, and that's another way of thinking about it. Anyway, so yeah, I think W.E.B established a whole new paradigm thinking about South Africa.
Well, that's different.
Oh, that's yes. Oh, excuse me. I love Latin too. Yes. All right. Yes. Well, she in that imperialist.
And capital non-capital.
Anyway, so yeah, I think it's, but you're right. I mean, these are very big political questions. How you understand relationships? Absolutely. And I'm the last one to begin to preach on that. So that's why I hide behind the voice.
Thank you very much for bringing this forward. It's kind of mentioned Ireland something. I wasn't quite following how to begin. But you think your time Marx Ireland, quite Marxist, Ireland's relationship with the Irish working class, to the English working class. So much you can expand on that. How do you want to start with this? I'm going to be going through the Bois journal. When we start critical, saying the to many of the possible complaints. And so I'm thinking about the date in 1920, 3 years after revolution. To what extent this revolution influences thinking up to down? What are the same society? It's almost as if it doesn't fit, and that doesn't quite fit. So perhaps you can explain to me the relationship between 1917 and 1920. I'm sorry.
But yes, he was always agnostic, skeptical of revolution as a strategy. He was skeptical, perhaps more of violence, and that's the pursuit. So he was agnostic about the question, so he wasn't agnostic. And he was editor of the crisis, and there were all sorts of people defending that question. So, in fact, what I look at, something happened that we need to swap it away. And as I said, back he said, what I have seen is Bolshevism. What I heard is Bolshevism. I am a Bolshevik. And I think that led him finally to read Marx. No, he had not read Marx. Yeah. No, he had not read Marx. He says so himself. The references to me. Yeah, after the argument. No, he has passages out quote from you as if it's straight from volume 3 of Capitalism. But he hasn't got it. He said he had to read it. He said it in 1930. All his teachers were not teaching him Marx. So he starts when they start asking his friends, socialist friends, to what Marx is about. He reads Capitalism. Not even these he's told to be dating with women. We don't have a lot of evidence. One of the evidence is from the apartheid. Of course, it gives the risk what he had. He gave some collected sort of summaries as in the 1950s. So that was his understanding. And so then he, as I say, that reconstruction, many of the ideas, particularly the ideas of the agency of the enslaved and the importance of the enslaved in the victory of the Northern armies in the Civil War. And that was he'd already written on that in 1910. But the construction of that story becomes very clearly Marxist. So I think that, yeah, I think that the Russian Revolution was incredibly huge and complex. In stories, this was this kind of history. It's not necessarily succeeding, and he sort of shut his eyes to it's not that's shut his eyes to many of the oppressive financial. Saying what the deep indignation was the hostility that developed towards racism, foreign and so that was so deep that countries that embraced him and his struggles and embraced struggles in their own terms, similar to his, was very appealing. And yeah, so we have to deal with that. I don't know what.
We have almost an end 6. So we have 6 minutes. I don't even try to read, so. All right. But come next week. Okay. That's fine.
Yes, well, that was precisely what the concept. There is a constitution here in the
So he's asking if there can be unity in the working class, white working class and black working class, superior white working class.
in the fact in relationship to the fact that there is a one group that is in place on the Du Bois in the next to the last chapter goes about saying an often called sentence refers to the ways in which a division within the working class talks about the psychological and the public good that the planter class, together with white, convinces white workers that if they make a division between white workers and black workers, they will feel superior. That's a psychological. But there's also, when people don't emphasize enough, a public point. And that is that white workers will have access to legal services, to the law, to the welfare, to education that is superior to and excludes blacks. So it is a construction of a division within the working class, what I call a segregated labor market. And yeah, so and that Du Bois has to face throughout his life, the existence of the segregated labor market. There are moments when there is integration solidarity. The miners' unions around the beginning of the 20th century, black workers and white workers were in the same union, struggling together. And he notices that. So he's looking for these possibilities. And even in Dark Horse, when he talks about the Eastern Lewis, he talks about how before the war there was developing a sort of coalition alliance between white workers, unskilled white workers, and black workers. And they were, because those unskilled white workers were actually being oppressed excluded by the craft workers, the skilled workers. So he's always looking for these moments. Overall, he faces all the time the reality of this segregated living. And that's why, in the moments of desperation or optimism, he talks about the possibility of the unification of the darker races of the world. And implies that these are the darker races of the world, refers to the proletariat. But they will in fact unify, that this excluded, lower branch of the segregated labour markets will actually begin to be agents of transformation. So in a sense, what he is saying is, well, Marx, when he talks about the difficulties of having interracial class solidarity, and he does do that, he seems to give the white workers comes in that sense. What it says, I know, they're not going to come to this. So it's up to the black workers to actually make that transformation. And it will be on the grounds of race.
All right, our last question, Fred.
Thanks. That's a simple question. I agree with you that essentializing Marxism. Aren't you perhaps essentializing black radical? It's quite clear towards the end of the slide that the voice goes to Ghana, effectively Ghana and Ghanaian sympathy. It becomes very close to Kwame Nkrumah. He is memorialized in Accra, and is the black radical tradition mutually exclusive of Marxism? There would be swathes of Marxists who would say that they are part of the black radical tradition. I think that you are simplifying things far too much.
That's a good way to end.
I'm telling you. Thanks, Fred.
I think I think that I am taking my understanding of Cedric Robinson's view of the black man tradition. I have not said much myself about that, except that I can't really find the Robinsonian black man tradition. But my view of the black man tradition, it would be another seminar to figure out what one might mean by that. Once one sort of puts Robinson aside.
So you're talking about CRBR. CRBR.
Be honest. He's a disruptor, this guy.
So we'll talk about this after 6 o'clock. I promise people at the meeting. It's not fair to discuss. I know we're structured to leave, so we promise that you can talk to them after strong.
Okay.
Or come, yeah. But I just want to say before you all run, thank you very much to the audience. So Michael's the first time we've had like this since COVID. So thank you very, very much. Next week we have 2 more seminars on the 9th and the 11th. It's Monday and Wednesday. We hope to see many of you here again. And now I ask if you've had food, please leave the flavor that goes into cleaning up after you. Take your cups, plates, and things back to the table and throw them away. But thank you everyone. See you next week.